We now have a special speaker, and we've talked to you about it with those of you that were here this morning. But first I want to say a few words about the initiative. I'm Roger Clay. I'm the president of the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. We have a mission of helping people and communities become and remain economically secure. One of our areas that we focus on is asset building, the other two being workforce and early care and education. This particular initiative that we're here to talk about these 2 days is a very important one for our organization and is the key initiative for our asset building area. We think closing the racial wealth gap is really important, not just for us to achieve our mission, but it's also important for the country. And it has the two dual goals of not only closing the racial wealth gap, but also involving experts of color in doing that. And we should always keep those two goals in mind. It's just not one goal. We've made a lot of progress, I think, over the last 5 years, this being the 5th time that we've met. And we are where we sort of wanted to start, when we wanted to from the beginning. From the beginning, we've said we wanted to affect policy. And we've taken measured steps over the last 4 meetings. And now we're meeting on Capitol Hill, and we're talking with people in the legislature and in the administration about policy. We still haven't changed policy, so that's the next step. But I think that we're having very constructive conversations with people. So I'm pleased with where we are going, but we have a lot of hard work to do. And I'm very pleased that the various legislators and people from the administration are coming here and talking with us and meeting with us, and a real exchange of ideas. So let me introduce Algernon Austin, who is going to introduce our speaker. We do that so you see more and more faces. Algernon is the director of the Race, Ethnicity, and Economic Program at the Economic Policy Institute. He is one of our featured speakers. He was on our website, featured experts. And for the last month, he's actually been featured on our website. So if you want to know a lot more about him, you know, look at our book, the little pretty book right there. He's an expert in the field of racial relations with a concentration on Black Americans. He focused on workforce income as a precondition to building assets. He's written books, articles, he's written a lot. And I would call him up now to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Roger. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jason Furman to the Closing the Wealth Gap Summit. Dr. Furman is Deputy Director of President Barack Obama's National Economic Council. As you might imagine, he has a very long and distinguished resume. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Dr. Furman worked for the Clinton administration, the World Bank, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and the Brookings Institution. And I'm leaving out a number of academic appointments. He has expertise on fiscal policy, tax policy, health economics, social security, and monetary policy. I cannot detail all of his accomplishments now, but I'd like to point to a few highlights. Dr. Furman was a key player in defending Social Security against attacks by the Bush administration. As a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, he pointed out that Social Security reaches more children in poverty than any other government program. Specifically on Hispanics, he stated, Hispanics benefit substantially from the design of Social Security because, on average, they have lower incomes, a higher incidence of disability, more children per family, and longer life expectancies. Hispanics are less likely to have access to employer-sponsored pension plans and consequently are much more reliant on Social Security for income in retirement. Regarding African Americans, Dr. Furman stated, African Americans benefit from Social Security's progressive benefit formula and from its disability and survivor benefits. African Americans make up 13% of the population, but represent 17% of those receiving Social Security disability benefits and 21% of the children who receive Social Security benefits. No doubt, other communities of color that are disproportionately poor and without retirement benefits also rely on and benefit disproportionately from Social Security. Given how much the stock market has declined over the last 2 years, it's clear that had the Bush administration's plan for private retirement accounts succeeded, many American retirees would be far worse off today. Immediately prior to joining the Obama administration, Dr. Furman was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and director of the Brookings Institution's Hamilton Project. The Hamilton Project's goals are to produce research and policy proposals for broad-based economic growth, enhance economic security for individuals, and for effective public investments. In his time at Brookings, Dr. Furman worked on a variety of issues. One particularly important issue that he addressed was healthcare reform. People of color are less likely to have health insurance than white Americans, and people of color with health insurance appear to be more at risk of losing their insurance than whites. We know that half of all bankruptcies are linked to our broken healthcare system. So without healthcare reform, wealth security for all Americans, and especially for Americans, for America's people of color, is gravely at risk. Dr. Furman argued, by meeting our nation's healthcare challenges, we can go a long way toward enhancing the economic security of individual workers, strengthening America's businesses as they struggle to compete in the global economy, and increasing our nation's overall productivity and fiscal soundness. His recommended solution was universal, effective, and affordable health insurance. The current state of the U.S. and global economy presents many challenges for the federal government and many challenges for increasing the wealth of America's people of color. In these perilous times, we're lucky to have someone who Paul Krugman described as a solid progressive working in the White House. I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Furman.
Thank you so much for organizing this workshop at a time when the world is contending with $50 trillion of destroyed wealth as a result of what's happened in the economy. I think it's really important that we're focused, as we are at the White House, on what we can do to get the economy going again in the short run and try to recover, in effect, some of that wealth, but that you're doing what you're doing, which is focusing on how people can participate in the economy and participate in economic growth, and in particular, participate in wealth creation and become a part of that society that we have. And I think having those nuanced messages of understanding the importance of something like Social Security and the bedrock of retirement security that it provides, something that's risk-free, something that people can count on year in and year out, not just for retirement, but also disability, survivors' benefits. At the same time, that you also understand that if that's all that someone has, that's not going to be enough to retire on. The target is replacing that 70% of your pre-retirement income in retirement. Social Security isn't going to get you there. While the market has its problems and has its hitches and its ups and downs literally today today being one of the up days, that over time, it is something that for people to be exposed to, for people to be able to accumulate wealth, to people to participate, is on balance a good thing. And one thing that I'll talk about a little bit more is what we can also do to make that a better thing economy-wide by having sounder financial regulation, more rules of the road in advance to prevent the type of problem we've had, but also the types of resolution mechanisms that once we've had this problem, we can go in and have much better tools at our disposal than we have today for dealing with a company like AIG, for example. So want to give you a little bit of a bigger context of the administration's economic policy, talk about some of the issues that I think are particularly important to wealth building, and then really open it up for both questions that you might have, but also even more important, any comments or input or suggestions that you have for the administration that you would like us to listen to. And I think one of my colleagues, Jeff Liebman, will be here tomorrow and is a big expert in these things as well. So what's happened recently in the economy is obviously is obviously the most serious economic crisis that this country has faced since the Great Depression. But one of the remarkable things about it is to put it in perspective of some of the disparities we have in our society already. The unemployment rate overall has risen to 8.1%, and that's something that we're rightly and justifiably, very upset and worried about, and doing everything we can to bring that unemployment rate back down. Well, 8.1% is actually a pretty decent unemployment rate for African Americans, historically speaking, in normal times. Before this recession started, the unemployment rate was 8.9% for African Americans, and now it's over 13%. So that gives you just a little bit of a sense of when people are talking about what's going on in the economy today, what it's like year in and year out in normal good times for large segments of our population. The unemployment rate for Hispanics being somewhere between the total and that for African Americans. So I thought that statistic, and what we've seen is as the unemployment rate has gone up, for each point it's gone up in this recession, for African Americans and Hispanics it's gone up about 1.5 points. You see that in what caused this, which is housing and subprime, where African American and Hispanic communities much more likely to conditional on the same earnings, the same every other quality, to get a bad credit score. And then if you have the same credit score, to be much more likely to put into a high interest rate loan or a subprime loan. As a result of that, you have home ownership rates that are below 50%, whereas for the population as a whole, it is 70%. And then when the housing market implodes, it's the people who don't have access to the conventional, conforming loans, which is the market that right now is continuing to perform reasonably well, with mortgage rates actually the lowest that they've been on record, with the data going back to 1971. But if you don't have access to loans through that market, you can still face very, very significant problems. So I think what we've seen lately has just highlighted some of the challenges that you are all working on. And the important thing to understand, though, is all of that also works in reverse. So for every point the unemployment rate has gone up, the African American and Hispanic unemployment rates have gone up by about 1.5 points. If we can, with fiscal stimulus, with our housing plan, with our financial stability plan, bring the unemployment rate down, you'll see that same thing happening in reverse. For every point it comes down, you would expect it to come down about 1.5 points for groups that have a harder time finding employment in good economic times. The same people who are the most severe, bear the most severe consequences of a recession are the people that will actually be the biggest beneficiaries of the economic stabilization steps that we're taking. And that's why in the short run, those plans are so important. And the first and most important part of those plans was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which the president signed about a month ago, $787 billion, including significant investments in 4 key areas: healthcare, energy, education, and infrastructure, as well as the most progressive tax cuts ever enacted, the most significant expansion of refundability in our tax system ever enacted, and the most significant aid to states to help with education and healthcare, which are the 2 biggest casualties of a recession ever enacted. Right now, our focus in that act is on implementing it and making it work. And the degree of oversight and accountability that's being brought to bear on that is quite extraordinary. Every day I get a memo that must have 3 or 4 pages of descriptions about what's going on throughout the federal government to make sure this money is being spent quickly and spent wisely, documenting the impact of it and flagging potential problems before they come to bear. That is the first part of the short-run strategy. The second part is housing, and that plan was released about a month ago. The detailed rules for it were released about 2 weeks ago, and the goal will be to help 9 million families either be able to refinance their loans or to modify their mortgages to make it more affordable for them to stay in their houses. And we're continuing to work through a lot of the things to make it so that that can happen quickly and that assistance can get out to people. And the third part is the financial stability plan, which gets at the financial markets that right now are very clogged up. A lot of important securities aren't trading, and our banks face major challenges. And there's a lot of different parts to that plan. Some of them have already been announced, whether they're about unfreezing credit for small businesses or in the secondary market for consumer loans, student loans, people trying to buy an automobile, any of those sorts of securities. What was announced today, a public-private partnership, which is a plan that will leverage up the resources that the federal government brings to bear, working in partnership with the private sector so that for every dollar we put in, we can get much more than $1 out to try to get some of these securities trading again and priced. And then finally, the stress test for our banks and our commitment to make sure that our banks are well capitalized. And I think it's important to understand what you've seen today as one element of a broader plan of which there have been several steps that have already been announced and an ongoing commitment to continue work by the federal government. And I think some of the criticism of the plan, and by and large we're quite gratified with the response that we've gotten today and the number of people who say that they're eager to participate with us and work together with us. But to the degree there's been any criticism, I think it's important to bear in mind that what was announced today was not the beginning or the end of the plan. It's one important part of an overall strategy. So that's what we're doing in the short run. And I think there's some out there that thought that was all the administration should do. We should just wake up every morning and think about what we can do to get the economy back on its feet by next year and not do anything else. That's not the president's view. The president, as I think he put it quite well last week, said if you're a family, you don't have a choice between paying your medical bills and paying your energy bills. You have to do both of them. And he feels he very much doesn't have a choice but to, first of all, address some of the problems that caused the current economic crisis, whether it's the rapid rise in health prices and the cost of health care, which certainly played a role in manufacturing job losses and some of the problems that face our auto industry, the instability in energy prices. But more importantly, he also doesn't, the goal of the president is not to get the economy back to the perfection that allegedly was in the year 2007. As I said, back in that year, the unemployment rate for African Americans higher than where it is for the general population today. The typical working age household had seen its income decline by $2,000, nearly $2,000, between the last business cycle in 2000 and the year 2007. So even before we went into the recession, families were seeing their income decline, not rise, and so really wants to reverse that. And an important part of reversing that is sort of policies in three areas. Number one is healthcare, and that is an agenda that's focused on slowing the growth and the cost of healthcare. A bunch of that was already in the economic recovery, whether it's health information technology, prevention, or comparative effectiveness research, and also to expand access to healthcare. And those are really two sides of the same coin. One reason we have a cost problem is the fragmentation, and one reason we have an access problem is just how expensive healthcare is. Obviously, you can't think about an agenda of wealth creation and giving people a stake in our society when every time someone gets sick, any wealth they've accumulated, they have to spend all of it on their illness. Insurance is an important part of what allows you to have your wealth, grow from year to year, and it's an important part of what everyone in this room is concerned about. A second part of our overall agenda is, and the top priority for the president, is energy and reducing America's dependence on foreign oil, which is important to creating jobs in our economy, important to creating an economy that has, for national security reasons, to reduce the instability that causes economic problems, and to address our long-run climate change challenges. And then finally, in terms of the top core agenda, is education. And education, the president's focused on everything from preschool through college, has announced an ambitious college completion goal of, by 2020, making the United States the best in the world in terms of college completion. And a really important part of his overall initiative is reforming the way in which we do student loans and reforming the way in which we finance college. There was a down payment on that in the economic recovery itself, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, $2,500 tax credit for college. It, in effect, consolidates a number of the different tax credits, makes them more generous, and quite importantly, is the first time we've had a tax credit for college that's partially refundable. Up to $1,000 of it is refundable, which is a very important principle. You shouldn't just have tax breaks for middle-class families. You want tax breaks that help everyone go to college. He wants to build on that by going further, and one step will be converting the Pell Grant, which right now is discretionary and every year has to fight, or it's sort of a mixture of mandatory and discretionary in Washington budget parlance, and that means every year has to fight for enough money for Pell Grants. Every year we tend to come up a bit short and people don't get the maximum they were promised, to move that over to the mandatory side of the budget, so it happens automatically year in and year out and automatically grows with inflation. In order to help pay for the cost of that, has proposed reforming student lending by basically cutting the middleman out of student lending programs and shifting over to the direct lending program. And education is, again, something that you can't, right now we have a situation where for African American and Hispanic households, I believe that the net worth for a college graduate is the same on average as the net worth for a white high school graduate. And part of the solution to that is changing the disparity in actually attending college. Obviously, a bigger part of the solution in that is changing the deeper underlying problems that lead to that. And that was the last thing that I just wanted to mention to you, was something focused, in this case, very specifically, directly at the problem rather than indirectly, which is the president has a very exciting initiative in his budget, which is to make it, which is automatic IRAs combined with an expansion in the savers credit. And the basic concept that he's trying to get at is about 75 million Americans don't have a pension at their workplace. They don't have a defined benefit pension plan. They don't have a 401k plan. So the first thing is you want virtually every American to actually have a pension plan at work. And under this proposal, it would require that all but the very smallest businesses set up a savings plan for their workers, and it could just be a workplace IRA, so the employer doesn't need to do anything more than the administrative costs associated with it, but they would set up an IRA in that worker's name, do all the paperwork for them. There would be default investment rules, all of that. The second thing is to take advantage of something that we've become increasingly aware and understanding in the economics literature in the last decade, which is the importance of defaults, that most people just do whatever, whatever's easiest for them. People are busy, people are inattentive. So the way in which you set up the defaults for these programs matters enormously. So under some of the congressional versions of the proposal, you would automatically have 3% of your pay withheld and directed into your own personal portable IRA plan. And your employer would have to set these plans up for you. You could opt out of them if you didn't want to save. If you followed the path of least resistance, you'd end up saving. Or even better, your employer would actually learn the benefits of this plan, the attractions, and set up, a full-blown 401k or defined benefit pension plan. Finally, the president recognizes that for Americans, for lower-income Americans, it's a lot harder to actually save. And so he also wants to provide more of an incentive. In addition to these institutional mechanisms to make savings easier, he wants to make it more rewarding. And right now we have a savers credit. The problem with the savers credit is, number one, it's not refundable. So the people who need the most help don't get it. Number two, it's complicated. It sort of changes every few $1,000s of income and is hard to follow. And number three, it's not generous enough. So he's proposing to expand it, making it refundable, taking it a little bit higher up the income scale, up to $85,000. Right now it ends at $50,000. And to make it a really simple structure of, if you save $1,000, the government will directly deposit $500 into your account. So your money, in effect, will grow 50% faster than how it would grow if you didn't have access to the savers credit. So it not just makes it refundable and simpler, but it also will lead more people to participate, because many people who are eligible right now don't even know about it and don't claim it on their tax forms. So you combine automatic enrollment in IRAs, everyone having one of these at their workplace, more generous matches. And the final thing, which the administration doesn't have a specific proposal, but it has a commitment to work on, is addressing the asset tests. And I think that's an important issue for all of you to think about as well, and help us think about ideas, which is, you don't want to be in a situation where you've now encouraged someone to save, you've given them help to save, and as a result, you take away their Medicaid or their SSI or their food stamps or what have you. And it's one of the painful ironies of our current system that some of the lowest rates of return on savings can be for low-income households, because by saving $1, they lose $1 of something else. And I think it's encouraging that some of the organizations that are more associated with free market and conservative principles have come around to really appreciate and understand that, and realize that without reform, some of these asset tests can in effect be just a way of reducing the rate of return and taxing people on their savings is another way of describing them. So that's another important issue that we're going to be focused on and studying and thinking about in the context of our overall agenda for savings and wealth creation. So that's a little bit of a summary of what we're doing right now. We're focused on both the short run and the medium run, and happy to take questions, comments, suggestions, and a glass of water if someone has one. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, when you take your ask a question, respond to a question, make sure you speak into the mic. And also, Jason Furman, you're in a room with about 75 experts of color, experts for various communities, studying various aspects of wealth creation. So if you have any questions for the audience, feel free to ask.
Bob Wynn with Asset Builders of America. In America, people tend to be consumers or producers, and it seems that far too many minorities tend to be consumers. And I'm wondering what in the plan is there to encourage more people of color to be on the production side of the equation, especially through entrepreneurship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important question. And let me give, this isn't a comprehensive answer, but let me give you one answer, one part of the answer, which is last week we announced a set of measures to improve the Small Business Association's 7A loan program. And that's a loan program that actually disproportionately benefits minorities who often aren't able to get credit through the normal channels at their banks, and as a result have to apply for a guaranteed loan through SBA programs. The problem is that program has ground to a halt because what banks normally do is they take the portion of the loan that's guaranteed and sell it on in the secondary market. They get the cash back, and that gives them more liquidity to make more loans or improve their balance sheet. And they haven't been able to do that because that secondary market has frozen. In the economic recovery, we had a provision that expanded the guarantees up to as high as 90%, waived the fee on the people borrowing the money, and that was helpful. But by itself, that wouldn't have worked because if banks don't want to make the loan, it doesn't matter how generous the government's terms are. So what we announced was we would purchase up to $15 billion of these securities, mostly in the secondary market, to help unclog that so banks would know that they'd be able to sell it on. And we've been working closely with community banks, and we've been working closely with SBA, Treasury, coordinating on this program. So I think that's not the total answer to your question, but that would be one example of how, by taking these types of really important programs that we already have, you'll see some of the minority community disproportionately benefiting.
Mr. Furman,
Yeah.
thank you for coming and coming to see us. My name is Rudy Arredondo with the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers, and my question to you has to do with the taxation of unemployment benefits and income tax refunds. Is there any plans within the administration to rescind this unjust tax?
I guess I could ask your opinion of it. The economic recovery included a provision, I believe it's just in effect for 2009, chance it's 2 years, I think it's just 2009, that the first $2,400 of benefits will be untaxed. From our perspective, the better and more progressive approach was just increasing the benefits directly. That was our proposal, by $25 a week. And the reason we preferred that is it means you get the money right away when you're unemployed, rather than having to potentially wait till the following April. And number two, that it's more progressive because the problem with rescinding the taxation is the higher your tax bracket, the more you benefit from that. So if you're the sole breadwinner in a family and you're unemployed, rescinding the taxation doesn't help you nearly as much as if you have a spouse who's making a lot of money while you're unemployed. So I guess I'd say the administration completely agrees with the impulse behind your question. We preferred to go the more direct route of temporarily increasing the benefits as our primary proposal.
My name is Dennis Comp, and I'm with the City of San Antonio. And I want to speak to three issues you put together. One was the fragmentation, the tax code. Now I forget the third one, but nevertheless, it's related. And I guess I want to give an example. We do about 40,000 tax returns a year, and the average adjusted gross income is about $18,000. Now, all these people qualify for children's health insurance, food stamps, and everything else, but they have to apply 5 or 6 different times. So when you think about it, I have to see 40,000 people 5 or 6 times a year, whereas if we could do it all during the taxing process, one is we could promote earnings. Oh, I know what it was. It was extending the resources that they can have, the assets they can have. So I guess my encouragement is back to the federal government. If you could use the tax code as a way to look at administering some of the health and human service and other benefits. One is you'd be able to save a lot of money on distribution. You'd be able to provide people combinations of packages, and you have more people coming out applying for the earned income tax credit, the saver's tax credit, and all the other credits that are available.
Right. I think you just made a very important point, because there's a lot in the tax policy community that get very, very nervous about tax expenditures, and they think that increases the burden on the IRS and complicates it. And there's some truth to that, and we have to be very mindful of the burden on the IRS. But we have to remember what you said, which is what's the burden on a person? And it might make it easier for the IRS if they have less to do, but if that means that the person then has to fill out 5 forms instead of 1, you haven't served our ultimate goal, which is really caring about citizens and their participation. Certainly that's something that making more things refundable, that we're going to have to think a lot more about. We're delivering more things in effect through the tax code. We're certainly looking at it in a number of areas of trying to get the IRS, which has a lot of this data, to interface with some of these other programs and share it both on the front end to make it easier for people, and on the back end so that we can have better enforcement that these are going to the people who really most need it. But I think that's an important point.
Thanks, Jason, for being here. I just wanted to follow up on Bob's question and your response. One of the areas of concern that this group has been addressing this morning is that in policy approaches that are universal in nature, they don't always get at the gap, the racial and economic, or racial and ethnic economic gap. And in the $15 billion purchase that you were talking about, that's to address the issues with the Small Business Administration, that may help small businesses overall, but are you tracking to determine what portion of that money is getting to minority business enterprises?
I think that's an important point, and frankly, I'm going to go back and follow up and find out the answer to it. I think SBA does track that type of information and does pay attention to it and focus on it, and that's part of why these SBA loans are disproportionately minority, because they make sure they're tracking that information. Certainly in a lot of the different spending programs through the economic recovery, it goes through a lot of the normal contracting rules and set-asides, and it's something that, again, we're monitoring the minority participation in the contracting wherever that's possible. But there's also 2 different definitions of there's different ways to think about universality. So the automatic IRA proposal I talked about is universal, everyone in the country, regardless of income, regardless of background. Then the Savers Credit is something where our biggest increases are for low-income households that are participating in that program. But so I think that striking that balance is obviously the right thing to be focused on.
Hi, my name is Donna Hernandez, and I'm with the Applied Research Center. I have several questions, but I'm only going to ask 2. The first question is, you talked about, yeah, we ask a lot of questions, but the first question, you talked about energy and creating jobs, and I want to know specifically how you're going to track that our communities are getting these jobs, and that the money, the green money that is being created is actually going to go into communities of color and into indigenous people. So then the second question is, I remember you saying something around education, that the idea was to sort of cut out the middleman between the student lenders and the students. Is there a plan to do that with housing as well, where we cut out the middleman there, and instead of bailing out the companies that caused the problem, instead giving the money to the people who could use the money to prevent them from going into foreclosure? So,
in answer to your second question, I see Lori Montgomery, the Washington Post, is here. I can tell you we don't have a plan to destroy the entire private mortgage industry. I expect that industry to continue. And but if she weren't here, no. And I think there's a difference between student lending and mortgage lending. There's three important differences. One, right now we have a direct lending program and operates side by side with a private program. And the direct lending program works extremely well and has much lower costs associated with it. And so we're going to basically shift and move from the subsidized loans to direct lending. The second thing is the student loans are actually much simpler products. There's only a few different variants, and people basically get the same ones, and sort of you're going to college, you graduate from college, you pay it back. Houses are more complicated. And then number three, we do think that the student loans should be subsidized because we think these important, economists would say externalities or public purpose to them. Whereas home ownership obviously gets certain subsidies through the tax code, for example, but we don't subsidize the lending itself. So I don't anticipate that we have any plans in that area. In answer to your first question, partly it's a hard thing to do because most of the green jobs we're talking about aren't the government going out and hiring people to do stuff. It's the government giving the private sector the incentives, and then to some degree through subsidizing research or energy efficient products or what have you, the tools to create those jobs. So part of what we're trying to do is transform the economy and a set of industries that we think are going to be very vital to, globally and not just in the United States, to make sure they happen in the United States, that we're exporting, that we have a critical mass here in this country. And when you're doing that, I think it's very hard because the effects of your policies are indirect to actually track what's going on. So I don't want to sort of make a promise that we can have like a full accounting or what have you. That being said, I think then, what the answer could be, and what I'll certainly go back and make sure we're focusing more on, is where things are more direct, where it's more the government contracting or procuring, that you are paying a lot of attention, and then to try to think about how to think about those indirect jobs. And I'm not sure I know the answer off the top of my head, but maybe someone does, and me not knowing isn't an excuse to not thinking about it. In fact, it's an argument to think more about it.
Hi, Jason. Maya Rocky-Moore. Thank you for being here. Two-part question as well. The Economic Recovery Act, the money's out the door. Yesterday, the New York Times ran a story showing that the education formula was actually layering on additional money onto school districts that actually already were already wealthy, whereas the more needier districts weren't necessarily getting the same level of resources. So part A of that question is are there any plans to go back and look at the formulas, particularly Title I in education, but also in other areas, for example, how these funds are being disseminated and applied in communities of color, making sure that they get priority in terms of this particular investment. So that's part A of the question. The part B is we've had several colleagues mention the issue of data. And I'd like to propose the notion of a working group that can look at data collection at the federal level across areas to figure out how we can strengthen our data collection so that we can get at some of these nagging issues, particularly as it relates to racial and ethnic minorities who aren't being tracked as well, like Native Americans and Asian Americans. And finally, I'd like to impart upon you that this is a vast network of very intelligent and accomplished professionals and scholars. And to the extent that there are commissions that the federal government is going to be put in place in various issue areas or working groups or anything, or even all those jobs that you all supposedly have available in Treasury. If you can tap into this network and use us, we're willing to be used so that we can advance some of these very necessary issues. I'd like to just put that out there as a proposal as well.
Okay. I realized my memory wasn't good enough to remember all the good suggestions you're saying, so I've started writing them down. And so I think a government-wide initiative on data would be something I'd be happy to take a look at, and can even just follow up with you directly after this if you have ideas about how to do that, because that's certainly one of the themes of all of this, is knowing what's going on to make sure that we can do it. In terms of the formulas in the recovery, I mean, the president's publicly said that he didn't think the Recovery Act was perfect, that no one thought it was perfect, would have done it that way. As you probably know, one of the most contentious issues at the very end of the negotiations really was those formulas. And there were certainly people with a variety of points of view, many of them with very strong feelings, and changes got made. There's some places which, for example, the school construction bonds that Charlie Rangel championed and put into legislation, I know, are something where I think you'd find the formula, much more sort of appealing and designed to get at I think focus on 125 of the most disadvantaged school districts in the country. I think it would be hard to go back to the Recovery Act and reopen all of that. I think, though, to the degree there's an opportunity going forward to take a look as we do new things and as we do more things. That certainly wasn't, the exact formula the administration proposed, and not the one, that we think should stick, forever going forward.
Hi, Jason, Jim Carr. First of all, let me just say thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today, because this is a group that, as you heard earlier, has been meeting now for many, many years. And so we've been in many places around the country. So to come to Washington and have the administration share key leaders of its staff with us is extraordinary for us. I have a question, and that goes to what the whole title of this group is. Mm-hmm. It's not just economic mobility. It really is closing the racial wealth gap. Mm-hmm. And it recognizes that it is there because of decades, if not centuries, of policies explicitly that created that wealth gap. And in many of the comments you've made, you've acknowledged and recognized and alluded to the severe disparities. And so building on several of the questions that have already been asked, I'm just wondering if you think that we can actually seriously make steps to close the racial wealth gap if we don't have policies that seriously aim at the unique and different problems that exist, for example, within just the foreclosure crisis, the disproportionate, unfair, and deceptive practices in communities of color that have resulted in disproportionate foreclosure, already suffering from economic calamity before, and now disproportionately suffering, or problems unique to native lands. Just doesn't seem that those policies, that generic policies, can close that gap. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that, if we need specific policies? And then just a quick comment, if you do, going back to Maya's comment, think that a commission might be useful. All of us would like to volunteer. Thank you.
That's great to have one-stop shopping. I think certainly you'll see. Right. I mean, the general tenor of what our regulators do with the regulations on the books, and then what we do to those regulations on the books, are going to change a lot. And there's a broad recognition that that needs to change. I think you're right, though. I mean, the statistics are sobering when you look at what happens in lending in communities of color, and credit scores and foreclosures and all of that. And so I think you're right that some specific approaches will be needed too. And the question is, getting your help to figure out just what those are.
Hi, I'm Derek Hamilton. I'm a professor at the New School. And I guess my question is, there seems to be a sentiment, I guess, as you're gathering from some of the questions, that perhaps the administration should consider some race-based policies. But if they don't, I guess what I would propose that the administration considers, given the disparities that exist in wealth, we know that about 95% of Latino and Black households are below the median wealth of a white household. And we can look at 2002, another period where we were coming out of recession. The median household wealth for black households were $6,000, $8,000 for Latinos, and $90,000 for comparable white households. The question I have is, could we use wealth as a criteria for class and give it as a measure for class to more directly target these groups? And I know you mentioned earlier the example of we don't want to tax savings or wealth, but the earned income tax credit, that policy presents an example where we were able to not tax people's work ethic, but still reward people using income as a base measure.
Yep. And I think that's an important question. I mean, the goals of a lot of our policies very much are about wealth and wealth creation and ownership. And I thought the phrase ownership society the last president used was a perfectly excellent phrase. I wish I'd thought of it myself, and I wish he had thought of some policies that would have promoted it. But for a lot of what we do day to day, like taxes, we do base our policies much more on incomes. And part of that is that income is much more easily measurable and observable and is a little bit less subject to some of the problems associated with trying to take account of people's wealth. So, sure, whatever you all have time for. Okay. Well, I think there's one woman who has a question. I will try to answer as quickly as you ask the question.
Last question. Well, thank you, Mr. Furman, for joining us here today. My name is Nandini Kutty. My question is about the Obama housing plan. Why does the plan not have any guidance with regard to intake and outreach for minority households and lower income households and minority neighborhoods, given that these groups were targeted for abusive subprime lending and are most deserving of help? And in the absence of these guidelines, the Obama housing plan has an inbuilt bias towards higher income households. For example, you have the 31% of income. Obviously, higher income households will be more easily able to meet that criteria of having monthly payments as 31% of income. Similarly, your 105% of the refinancing is possible only if the mortgage is 105%. That also means that only households that are not very deep underwater are the ones who will be eligible for it. So I think we need some explicit guidelines to make sure that the groups that are most that were targeted for abusive subprime lending are helped first.
Okay, and I'll take that as another good comment. Some of those problems are things that some of the questions you've raised, like the intake and the outtake, are something we can certainly take a look at to make sure that people have the proper awareness and can take advantage of what's there. The broad architecture of the plan in terms of what the debt to income and all that is based on a set of difficult and complicated trade-offs between wanting to help people, wanting to make sure and that you're targeting your assistance in the right way. I think that's probably harder to change at this stage. But that being said, with the program the way it is, we should be doing the most we can to make sure that everyone who can take advantage of it really does. So we'll go back and ask them that question.
Okay, and can everyone join me in thanking?
Thank you.